Hey everyone, Pastor Tommy here. Want to make a video just kind of clarifying some things about the temple and temple language. I am shocked and kind of amazed by a lot of the confusion that is out there when it comes to certain language of the temple, and I want to clear up what might seem as some inconsistencies in temple language. I think there's a lot that people just don't understand where certain people within the theological world and who kind of understand certain things about the temple. It's one of those deals, we always know what we're talking about, but often people on the outside who are not familiar with certain things, they get confused. It's kind of like if I listen to mechanics talking, or doctors talking, while all the things they're saying might be completely accurate, it is very likely and very possible that I will not understand what they're saying, or I might even misunderstand some of the things that they're saying because I am not familiar with all those terms, because I am ignorant when it comes to many of those things. And so I think there's some areas where there is a lot of ignorance, and I'm not saying that in any kind of insulting way. It's okay to be ignorant in an area. It doesn't mean you're dumb. It just means you don't know about that subject. And so hopefully, if you understand some of these things, it will maybe clear up any confusion that you're hearing as people talk about the temple. For example, the Wailing Wall. There's a lot of people saying that nobody claims that the Wailing Wall was ever a part of the temple. Well, actually, that's very false. In fact, if the modern temple location is correct, the traditional location, if that was correct, then that Wailing Wall would, in fact, be a part of the temple. Now, when you hear that, that's blowing your mind. You're thinking that doesn't make any sense at all. That's because you don't understand temple language. After I explain this to you, you will understand what that means. And often Christians, the way we speak, modern Christians, the way we speak of these things, when they say, okay, and let's just say that the Temple Mount, a traditional mount, is the correct location. If I hear a Christian, a 21st century Christian, get up and say that wall was never a part of the temple, because Jesus said there wouldn't be one stone left upon another, I'm going to agree with them, and I'm not going to necessarily correct what they're saying. I know what they mean by that. But then if I hear a Jew, if I hear an Orthodox Jew get up and say that wall was the western wall of the temple, I'm not going to correct him either, because I know what he means when he says that. And in reality, what he is saying, the Orthodox Jew, lines up more with the scriptures. But often we don't correct people when they say things that are technically wrong when we understand what they mean. But many people are confused right now because I don't think they're understanding the different uses of the language, and therefore things are not computing. There's conflict. And so I'm going to help you understand these things. And yes, if the traditional Temple Mount is the right location, I do not believe that it is, but if it were, yes, that Wailing Wall would have been a part of the temple. And let me just, before we start looking at some pictures and different things, I do want to take some time to point out some things in the scriptures that I think it's important that we are aware of, because there is a way that we speak of things, and then there's a way the Bible speaks of things. And while often the concept of what we are trying to explain is accurate, our use of language is not always consistent with the scriptures. And this is a total nerd subject, and if you're not interested, I'm not mad at you for it. But if you want to learn something, I encourage you to continue watching this video, because if we're not aware of Bible language and how the scripture is using certain words, it's going to be very easy for somebody to come along and sound like they're speaking biblically because they're using Bible words. But if they're not using those words the way the Bible does, then it's going to be easy for them to teach something that's false. Okay, and so for example, when I say temple, what do you think of? When I say tabernacle, what do you think of? Okay, now, if you're like me, when I hear somebody say tabernacle, I think of the tent that Moses pitched. I picture the place of worship that was portable, that they could move around. When I hear temple, I think of the permanent location. Here's a picture of a model of what they believe Solomon or Herod's temple looked like. And so that's what's in my mind when somebody talks about the temple. If somebody says tabernacle, I think more of like a tent, something portable. Okay. And so often we will, in our theological world, we will say we got to understand the difference between the tabernacle and the temple. The tabernacle was the tent. The temple was the physical permanent building. But is that always how the Bible uses those terms? Well, actually, it is not. Okay. And so even though we all get what the person's saying, you can find a place in the Bible where what we would refer to as the tabernacle is referred to as the temple. In 1 Samuel 1:9, it says, so Hannah rose up after they had eaten in Shiloh, and after they had drunk. Now Eli the priest sat upon a seat by the post of the temple of the Lord. So wait a minute, I thought there wasn't a temple until Solomon's day. Well, again, when we're trying to make that distinction, but we do see the tabernacle referred to as the temple in 1 Samuel. In 1 Samuel chapter 3, we see that it says in 1 Samuel chapter 3, let me get it where I can see it here. It says, and ere the lamp of God went out in the temple of the Lord, where the ark of God was, and Samuel was laid down to sleep. So if I want to be contentious, if I want to prove somebody is inconsistent, if somebody gets up and they're making that distinction between the portable location and the permanent location, and they're using temple for the language for the permanent, tabernacle for the portable, I could show an inconsistency. Because there is a place in the Bible where the tabernacle is referred to as the temple. But is the basic concept of what they're saying true? Yes, there was a permanent location and there was a portable location. We all choose to refer to the portable as the tabernacle and the permanent as the temple. But the Bible is not 100% with us on that. And so, and when it comes to certain things where we're trying to make these distinctions to make things clear, the Bible does not always use that language as consistently as we would like it. So what we have to do in all these situations is we have to look at context. We have to pay attention to the entire passage and what the Bible is trying to explain. And so I'm going to show you, too, why I believe that the Wailing Wall would be a part of the temple if it in fact was the right area. I'll show you why that is. You see, you're getting the wrong idea in your mind when you hear me say the Wailing Wall was a part of the temple. I know what you're thinking. I'm going to show you what you're thinking here in just a little bit. But let me look at a few other scriptures. And so in Exodus 25:8, it says, and let them make me a sanctuary that I may dwell among them, according to all that I show thee, after the pattern of the tabernacle and the pattern of the instruments thereof, even shall ye make it. And so that tabernacle, that was that tent. That was a sanctuary. The temple was a sanctuary. The tabernacle was a sanctuary. And we do, most of the time in the Bible, when it's referring to the portable sanctuary, it's referred to as a tabernacle, but not 100% of the times. And most of the time in the Bible, when it's referring to the permanent spot, it is referring to what we would call the temple. And so, again, I'm not going to go correct everyone who maybe says something that's not 100% right all the time if I basically understand the gist of what they're saying is true. We see in 2 Samuel 7:5, it says, go and tell my servant David, thus saith the Lord, shalt thou build me an house for me to dwell in? Whereas I have not dwelt in any house since the time that I brought up the children of Israel out of Egypt, even to this day, but have walked in a tent and in a tabernacle. In all the places wherein I have walked with all the children of Israel, spake I a word with any of the tribes of Israel, whom I commanded to feed my people Israel, saying, why build ye not me an house of cedar? Okay, so notice how we have a distinction in the language here between a tabernacle, something that's more temporary, something that's movable, and a house of cedar. Okay, you don't move around. A house of cedar. You don't move around. A house that is made with stones. This is something that's permanent. And so, yeah, God is using, so the thing is, if somebody comes along and is like, well, I think the tabernacle is the house of the Lord. Okay, yeah, I get that, but it wasn't a house of cedar. It wasn't a permanent house. We see that the patriarchs, they dwelt in tents. Okay, yeah, if somebody refers to it as their house or their home, that's fine. But the whole point of the reference to these tabernacles is just showing they didn't have a permanent dwelling place. They had to move around, they were sojourners. And so whenever we see a house or a dwelling place that's made with stone, we see something that's more permanent. And that's the main point of what the Bible's trying to explain. So, so those terms are not going to be exactly the same. Now, I'm going to ask you a question here, and I want you to think about the thoughts that go into your mind, okay? And be honest with yourself. I'm going to ask you a question, and I'm going to show two different ways this can be answered, and both are accurate, depending on how we are using the word temple, okay? And I'm going to show you that, again, nobody's 100% consistent on how they use the word temple, including the Bible. I'll show you that here in a little bit. You always have to look at context and how it's being referred to. But here's the question. Did Jesus ever go into the temple? Okay. Now, what entered your mind? What thought went into your head when I asked that question? Did Jesus ever go into the temple? Now, here, if in your mind, what probably did for many of you is you're thinking about this place right here, this part here that's sticking up. That's often what we think about as the temple, just that part right there. But the reality is, okay, this picture, and let me show you this one here. Right here, what you are seeing, this is a model they have at the Rockefeller Museum over in Israel. And so the reality is everything within these walls right here, within these four walls, is all considered part of the temple. And of course, Jesus went into the temple. Many people went into the temple. But if you're thinking about just this part right here, which inside those doors, you have the holy place. And then within there, you have the Holy of Holies. We all are well aware of the fact that only the priests and the Levites were able to go in there, and only the high priest was able to go into the Holy of Holies. And I do not believe that Jesus ever went into this part right here, into this section that is sticking up there. I don't think there's any evidence Jesus ever went into the holy place. But obviously, there's no way we can get around the fact that the Bible says Jesus went into the temple. But again, some of you, though, when you say that, if somebody comes along and says Jesus never went into the temple, well, if you're referring to the holy place or the Holy of Holies, I would agree with you. In fact, the Bible tells us in Hebrews chapter 9, verse 24, it says, "For Christ is not entered into the holy places made with hands, which are the figures of the true, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God for us, nor yet that he should offer himself often as the high priest entereth into the holy place every year with the blood of others." So when it talks about the holy place, whenever that priest would go inside that structure, inside that building, that was where they had the candlestick, the table of showbread, the altar of incense, and then you had the veil, and inside there was the Holy of Holies, and the priest would go and put sprinkle blood on the mercy seat. There's no evidence that Jesus ever went inside there, and here it's saying Christ is not entered in there, because the sacrifice Christ made was not made inside that temple. It was made outside the gate. But Jesus went into the temple many times. We have references in the Bible to Jesus going into the temple. In Matthew chapter 21, verse 12, it says, "And Jesus went into the temple of God and cast out all them that sold and bought in the temple, and overthrew the tables and the money changers and the seats of them that sold doves, and said unto them, It is written, My house shall be called a house of prayer, but ye have made it into a den of thieves. And the blind and the lame came into the temple, and he healed them. And when the chief priests and scribes saw the wonderful things that he did, and the children crying in the temple and saying, Hosanna to the Son of David, they were sore displeased." So, it sounds kind of like we got a full-blown free-for-all going on inside the temple. But again, it wasn't inside the holy place. It wasn't inside that building. It would have been within this area. Now, let me show you here's something from the Temple Mount Institute. And we have a lot of Baptists now that are fully on board with Jewish tradition and the Temple Mount Institute. They know what they're talking about. And here it shows the different areas. You know, you have the court of Israel, you have the women's court, the court of the priest. All of the stuff that's inside of these walls here would all be considered in the temple. But you had certain places within the temple that obviously were more important and that were more sacred, and not everybody had access to. I'm sorry, ladies, there were certain areas that you weren't allowed to go into. And sorry for all of us Gentiles, we wouldn't have been allowed anywhere near there. In fact, we see a riot broke out when they thought Paul brought somebody into the temple. Now, here's what I'm not 100% sure about. I don't know that these models are 100% accurate. I don't know for sure they got these things right. They're based off of, a lot of it's Josephus. It's more than just the scriptures. But either way, all of that is considered part of the temple. So often in the Bible, when you see people going into the temple, when you see it's referring to anything within that complex. So let's look at this picture here. This is one I took of the modern Temple Mount. So if that were right, okay, everything within those walls there, you have that eastern wall right there, everything inside there would be considered in the temple. But what most of you think, for example, too, when Jesus said, "See ye not all these things, there should not be left one stone upon another," you think that is referring only to this structure. Okay, that's what you think. And this is why Christians and Jews speak differently. Because the Christians, they have bought into this idea that the Wailing Wall, is legit, that that the Temple Mount area is right. And so therefore, if that Wailing Wall is a part of the temple, well, then that messes with Jesus' prophecy. So what the Christian world has done is they have made the temple only this building. But the Jews, they understand that, wait a minute, no, all of this was considered the temple. So this wall that you see there in the back, that would be the western wall. And so part of that actually is the wall of the temple. So the Jews are actually more accurate and consistent in their use of language. And so here's the big question. When Jesus said there would not be one stone left upon another, was he just referring to what Christians want to refer to? So Jesus and the Jews can be right? Or was he referring to everything? Okay. Now, here's the thing. It says in Matthew 24, and Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came to him for to show him the buildings of the temple. So it's not just one building. Okay? It's buildings. And so would it include these walls that surround there that had chambers and dwelling places that were a part of the temple? I mean, there's a lot of references to these things in Ezekiel and Nehemiah. It talks about them rebuilding all of these things. All of that was a part of the temple. So Christians, by necessity, because they believe that the Temple Mount modern location is right, they have changed the language of the temple to where it can only mean just this one building, this one part. But no, I think it seems pretty clear that Jesus is talking about everything. It's all going to go down. It's all going to be destroyed. And so the thing is, if the traditional location is right, okay, then that prophecy did not fully come to pass because that western wall is still there. And so what people say, well, no, that's just a retaining wall for a platform, for the platform. That's what people are saying. But wait a minute, if it's a wall for the temple, then it is a part of it. Even if it is partially a retaining wall, it's still a part of the temple, because the temple was not just that structure in the middle, it was that entire area. And I believe it all went away because all of these were holy places too. Even the part, anything within the walls of the temple, it was part of the sanctuary. It was a part of the holy place. Let me show you this too in Matthew chapter 23 in verse 35. Note it says there that upon you may come all the righteous blood shed upon the earth, from the blood of righteous Abel unto the blood of Zacharias, the son of Barachias, whom ye slew between the temple and the altar. Okay? Now, so why are you bringing that up? Well, I'm bringing that up because of the fact that, again, just showing that the way that certain language is used, it's not always the exact same in the Bible, because the altar, okay, so right here we have the temple, and inside that building is the holy place, and outside here somewhere, it's hard to tell from this picture, and I don't even know if they have it designated on there, but the altar was something that was outside that building. So you see, in our modern 21st century American culture, you can't be in a place when you do not have a roof over your head. Okay? But that's not how it was in the Bible. Much of the temple was outside and exposed to the elements. And yes, the brazen altar was something that was outside the holy place, but it was still within the temple. But it was outside and exposed to the elements. And they still use that same use of language today. So when it comes to the traditional Temple Mount. So right here, what we're looking at, that's the all of that area that we're looking at inside those walls, all of that is referred to as Al-Aqsa. Here you've got that eastern gate right there in the center. If you walked inside there, they would tell you today, you are in Al-Aqsa. But at the same time, the Al-Aqsa Mosque is over here. Now, I've never been inside the Al-Aqsa Mosque. That's that little black roof building right there. That is the third most holy place in Islam, I believe. And I've never been inside that building. But I have been in Al-Aqsa. Okay? And the Dome of the Rock that's here in the center. This is known as the Dome of the Rock, but all of that is within the Al-Aqsa compound. So if you go over to Israel today, they will tell you that entire walled area up there that, the Christians and the Jews refer to as the Temple Mount, they refer to all of it as Al-Aqsa. And if you are behind those walls, technically you are in Al-Aqsa, but it doesn't mean you're inside the mosque. And even back in Jesus' day, if you were within those walls, you would be in the temple, even though you are not in the holy place or the Holy of Holies. Even though you don't have a roof over your head, you still would have been in the temple. But in America today, we don't think about being inside a place until we are actually go through a door and we have a roof over our head. But that's not the way they spoke of things in the Bible days, and that's not the way they speak of things today. So I say all that to just say, all of this is in the temple. Everything that you are looking at here within these four walls, all of this is the temple, not just this part here right in the center. And so the image that's in a lot of Christians' minds today is they see this building, they see that platform that the Dome of the Rock sits on, and they picture, they think, well, just the temple had to be tore down. And for some weird reason, they even think that platform up there is the one that the temple would have been built on, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense. If everywhere else you go in the old city, if you ever see a spot that they say dates back to the time of Christ, it's always like 20 or 30 feet underground. That because the city, those old cities, they always built over itself. But for some reason, that platform up there, that's all original. And that doesn't even make sense. That's not consistent with anything else in that area. But either way, hopefully this helps you understand the language. And so, yes, this Wailing Wall right here, this is a picture that I took. That if that was the Temple Mount location, then this would have been a wall of the temple. There's no doubt about it. So in reality, when the Jews say this was the western wall of the temple, they're right, if that was the Temple Mount. When Christians say, no, that wasn't, well, I know what they mean, okay? They mean it wasn't, so right, it wasn't the wall of this part of the temple right here. That's what they mean by that. And that was something I was confused at one time too, because I'm thinking, if the Jews think that the temple was built where the Dome of the Rock was, nobody thinks it was that big that the wall would have extended all, or that, the building would have extended all the way to where the Wailing Wall is. Well, yeah, they don't think that. Nobody thinks that. They, though, like the Bible, considered that outer area all a part of the temple. And so that's what everybody needs to get a hold of. And so sometimes when you hear people talking about the temple and going into the temple, we're referring to this. You're referring to the holy place. I guess if we wanted to be completely accurate, we would say when the priests went into the holy place. But the Bible, sometimes when they go into the holy place, is specifically referring to that. But it's not hard to tell. Okay? Every place in the Bible where you see somebody going into the temple, it's not hard to figure out specifically what's going on, because obviously only the Levites were allowed to go into the holy place. So if we're seeing references to multitudes of people in the temple, we know it's in that outer area. But let me show you one. Show you one example of somebody going inside the holy place, even though it's referred to as the temple. But it says, I think it's in 2 Chronicles 26:16, talking about Uzziah, said, "But when he was strong, his heart was lifted up to his destruction, for he transgressed against the Lord his God and went into the temple of the Lord." Now, when he went into the temple of the Lord, was he going within these walls, or was he going into this specific structure? Well, yes, he was going into that specific structure, into the holy place. How do we know? The way we know is the very next sentence, because it says he went into the temple of the Lord to burn incense upon the altar of incense. Okay, so he didn't go into the altar that was outside the building and exposed to the elements, but he went inside the holy place, because that's where the altar of incense was, right before the veil of the Holy of Holies. And King Uzziah, even though he was a king, he was of the tribe of Judah. He was not a Levite. He was not a priest. He was not supposed to be in there. And that's one of the reasons I don't think Jesus ever even went into that temple. Not even because, for one, you say, well, Jesus could have went in that temple. Well, of course he could have, because of who he was. Now, the Jews would have freaked out if he would have done it. But here's the real reason Jesus didn't go in that temple. It wasn't because the temple was too good for him. He was too good for that temple. That's the reality. That temple was not like it should have been, because the priests had been doing a really bad job in keeping it cleansed like they were supposed to. But I show you that it just referred to him as going into the temple, but where it's specified is when it talks about him offering up a sacrifice on the altar of incense to burn incense. And the Bible says when he did, he became leprous. Leprosy arose in his forehead, and then the priests went and they drove him out of the temple. They got him out of there, because a leper especially couldn't be in there. And so, just showing the Bible is not, it's not always as specific as we are in its use of the term temple. You always have to look at context. And we like it when we can just look at a word and have one definition. It means the same thing every time. But no, sometimes when they went to the temple, it was referring to the entire complex. Sometimes it's referring to the holy place. You always just have to look at context in every situation. And so when Christians over there say that the Wailing Wall has nothing to do with the temple, they probably mean this part of the temple right here. And yes, technically they would be right. When the Jews say the Wailing Wall was a part of the temple, they mean the entire thing. and their language is actually more consistent with the scriptures and how the Bible refers to the temple. So I would agree with both. Again, if I believed that the modern location is right, and I wouldn't necessarily correct either one, because I understand both languages, the language that the Christians using and the languages the Jews using. What they are trying to communicate is accurate in both situations. So here's the big question. When Jesus is looking at the buildings of the temple, and he said there would not be left one stone upon another, was he only referring to this right here? Was he referring to those that are more white in the center? Only those, but the walls are fine. They can remain intact. They could all stay. Well, I personally think, and I'm not even going to take time to go into all of it, but especially if you go into Ezekiel and you're reading about a lot of the structures, I think it's all of it. I think every bit of it was thrown down. All of it went away. And interestingly enough, you look at some of the historical writings, and they will talk about how after the temple was destroyed, people like Josephus, had he not remembered it, had he not seen it before, he said, you never even know that the temple was even there. That's what he said about it. A few hundred years later, when the Bordeaux Pilgrim came through and he wrote about the things that he saw, and he went up into the tower of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and he looked out toward the east, he says all that you could see is that remnants of that Roman fortress, Antonia. And so I believe that these walls that we're seeing here, obviously the parts that we're seeing here were added to later, and they're like Byzantine period, but I believe that area was a area of a Roman fortress. I believe that the Wailing Wall, that this was a part of a Roman fortress, and it wasn't just a retaining wall, even though part of it definitely served that purpose. But the Christians are trying to say that because they want you to think that the temple just had to go down to here where this platform is, and that right where that Dome of the Rock is, at one time you had a structure that looked more like this. That's what they're trying to do to make, what Jewish tradition says fit with Bible prophecy. But the reality is they're changing the use of language. And so I believe all of it's gone. And so when you hear people say that if the Wailing Wall was a part of the temple, then Jesus' prophecy wasn't right, they're actually right. Because yes, that would have been a part of the temple if we're using that term the way the Bible does. And not everybody uses it the same. Not everybody is consistent in their language on that. And even the Bible is not completely consistent in how it uses that language. And so what we have to do every time is we have to look at context. And so the reason I believe all of this is gone is because Jesus, when looking at the buildings of the temple, not looking at the building of the temple. No, the buildings, in my opinion, it includes all of it. That makes more sense. That fits with the prophets and what they said when it talked about Jerusalem and Zion becoming heaps and dens of dragons. When God casting it out of his sight, that's what lines up with history. That's what lines up with archaeology. And so that is one of the many reasons that I do not believe that the modern location is accurate. And so I wish, language was more consistent, but it's one of those things you just have to be aware of the different ways those terms are used. And you have to take everyone within their context of what they are specifically speaking about. And you have to do that exact same thing in the Bible. Sometimes in the Bible, when they went into the temple, they went within these 4 outside walls. Sometimes in the Bible, when they went to the temple, they went specifically into this structure. But it is my belief Jesus never went into that structure. And I'll close with one more passage of Scripture. One, the New Testament doesn't record him doing that. But again, not because the temple was too good for Jesus. No, because he was too good for the temple. And it says in Malachi 3:1, it says, "Behold, I send my messenger, and he shall prepare the way before me, and the Lord whom ye seek shall suddenly come into his temple." Now, what do you think the Jews would have thought when they heard that in that day? They would have pictured in their mind Jesus going into here. Now, we do see Jesus going into this area during his triumphal entry. We absolutely see that take place. But let's read a little bit more. It says, "But even the messenger of the covenant whom ye delight in, behold, he shall come, saith the Lord of hosts. But who may abide the day of his coming? And who shall stand when he appeareth? For he is like a refiner's fire and a fuller's soap. And he shall sit as a refiner and purifier of silver. And he shall purify the sons of Levi, and purge them as gold and silver, that they may offer unto the Lord an offering in righteousness." Now, when you think about him offering an offering, the Levites offering an offering, where does your mind go? Well, I picture them in this area, right outside the holy place structure, on the brazen altar of incense. I picture them offering an offering right there. But we never saw that at Christ's coming. We don't see Jesus using the Levites to offer up an offering right there. It says when he does it, then shall the offering of Judah and Jerusalem be pleasant unto the Lord as in the days of old and as in the former years. None of that happened at Jesus' triumphal entry. You know why? Because they were not ready for him at his appearing. They didn't. His house was to be called a house of prayer for all nations. They had made it into a den of thieves. And he declared it desolate. Why? Because of all the abominations that had taken place there. That temple was not ready, and it was not holy enough for a holy offering to be given to take away sins. And so what do we see in the Bible? We see in Hebrews, it says Christ is not entered into the holy place made with hands. But later we see in Hebrews, it tells us, let us follow him without the gate, bearing his reproach. Rather than an offering being made within that temple, we see Christ was taken outside the gate, and he was taken out on a hill, and he was offered up. And he offered up himself as a sacrifice. He offered up himself as a perfect sacrifice. And they destroyed that temple of his body. But in 3 days later, he raised it up again. And that offering that was made on Mount Calvary, that was the offering that took away sin. That was how the prophecies would be fulfilled about the offerings, about the sacrifices, about the temple. All of those prophecies found their fulfillment, not within this area. The prophecies they all found their fulfillment outside the eastern gate, before the temple of the Lord, on a hill directly east of the temple that the Bible calls Mount Calvary. Now, the archaeologists, they don't acknowledge that, but I do. I believe Jesus was crucified east of the temple, and that was the sacrifice for sins. And whether we have the locations on that right or not doesn't matter. Here's what matters: Jesus did go outside the camp, and he did make a sacrifice somewhere over there in Jerusalem. I don't even really care where the exact spot was. It'd be cool to know. I'm interested. I have opinions, but they make no eternal difference. What matters is that we believe the words of the book, and that's why I'm not looking for prophecy to be fulfilled within many of the prophecies to be fulfilled within the temple, except for negative ones involving an antichrist and a fake temple. That's what I believe. And so, either way, hopefully this helped educate you on temple language. And there's so much more when it comes to temple language that we are not aware of because we were never under that system. And there's a lot of things that people get wrong. And those are subjects for another day. I would encourage people to watch my a podcast I did about the sons of God in Job. And that always makes people's head explode. Because, again, we've taken a lot of these terms the Bible uses that are kind of mysterious to us, and we've just come up with our own theories. And it's like, wait a minute. We can actually learn from the law what these things meant. Let's use that language the way the Bible does, and we'll find out, hey, this stuff that we're seeing in Job 1 and 2, this isn't going on in heaven. This is going on in earth. And that makes people's heads explode when they hear that. But that's because their language is not consistent with the Bible. And so they do. When they hear you say that, they hear you saying crazy things because you're using the same words as them, but what they don't realize, you're using them very differently. The question is, who's using those words like the Bible does? And those are interesting studies. Those are fascinating subjects. I love this subject. It's something I just find very interesting. I like to nerd out on, and I'm thankful to have a podcast where I can talk about these things rather than boring people in church about it. Because it's not the most spiritually edifying thing in the world, but it's a lot of fun if you just want to nerd out. And so hopefully you enjoyed this and it will help you. And don't go just declaring somebody inconsistent when it comes to these things. Nobody's language is completely consistent on these things. And I think we should try to be consistent. I think we need to be clear in our communications, and I'm working on that. But at the end of the day, I'm not the Pope of the world, and the world is not consistent on this. And the Bible has multiple ways it does it too. So I can't really fault people. I always just have to ask for context, and sometimes we have to ask for clarification. And so if somebody tells me Jesus never went into the temple, okay, I'm going to have to ask for clarification. Well, wait, what do you mean by that? Because the Bible says he went into the temple. Do you mean into the holy place? Or is that what you mean? Because if that's what you mean, I agree with you. But if you were referring to the the full temple area, I disagree with you completely because of what the Bible says. The Bible does call all of that the temple. So anyway, but that definitely shows why the many Jews say that this was the western wall of the temple. They are actually more accurate in their use of that term, wall of the temple, than Christians are. And so you just got to ask who's talking and how they're using the language. And so anyway, thank you for watching this. Hope it was helpful. We'll see y'all next time. God bless.